Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this webinar. We're going to get started in just a second at the top of the hour. All righty, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us. It's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll let some people filter in here still. Thanks for joining us. My name is Sammy Focarino. I'm the Senior Events Manager here at Consensus, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. This webinar is presented by Consensus. Consensus is an intelligent demo automation platform that enhances customer experience, engages high potential buyers, and shortens sales cycles with interactive video demos and tours. You can learn more at goconsensus.com. We are so excited to be gearing up for the biggest event in pre-sales and the first ever buyer enablement focused event, Demo Fest. We've done this for the last couple of years. Last year saw over 5,000 people register to join us. We're going to have over 50 sessions from over 60 top thought leaders, coaches, leaders in the space, and it's just going to be, I think, our best event yet. So registration is now open. I will post the link to register in the chat, but you definitely don't want to miss this. It's a free event, so there's no cost to you to join, and it is just going to be some of the most valuable sessions to date, I think. So definitely make sure you join us. We encourage you to participate in today's webinar. Our speaker will answer any questions at the close of the session, but you're welcome to post your questions at any time through the Q&A box. If at any time you're having technical difficulties, press the help button on the right side of your screen. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Tom Edwards is an accomplished solutions consultant and thought leader with more than 8 years of experience in pre-sales. He is a qualified accountant who began his career in finance at Johnson & Johnson before joining Blackline, a leading provider of accounting software. Passionate about people and project management and aspiring to contribute to solutions consulting leadership, Tom has led numerous global projects, including the successful global rollout of an ROI calculator across sales and pre-sales, as well as increasing pre-sales efficiency with the implementation of a well-known demo video automation platform. I wonder who that could be. And with that, I'm going to turn the rest of the time over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sammy. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And the aim of this afternoon's session is to take you through the cost of doing nothing, using financial metrics to help you sell your products and services. And I want to start this session off with getting everyone on here to think about, first of all, do you have a good relationship with your prospects and your customers? And I guess I hope everyone here is thinking, yes, I do have a good relationship. Okay, so then my second question is, can you get your client or your prospect or your customer to do exactly what you want? And I'm going to guess the answer is probably sometimes. Because if we could always get our client or prospect to do exactly what we wanted, we would always get them to buy from us. We would always have 100% win rates. Okay. Now, if we turn that on its head, now have a think about, can your prospect or your customer get you to do exactly what they want? Okay. Whether that is achieving the outcomes they want from your solution, or maybe it's getting just the right information at just the right time to help them build a robust business case. And I think, again, the answer to that is probably sometimes. So why is it that the desired outcomes of buyers and sellers can often be misaligned? Well, that's the question that I was asking myself when I had a sofa stuck halfway up a flight of stairs. Yes, I literally recreated this scene from the TV show Friends, that I know lots of you will have seen this. This is going back a few years ago. I'd just bought a new apartment in central London, and obviously the first thing I wanted to do was to have a sofa to sit on. And I ordered one. A couple of weeks later, two gentlemen turned up in a van. They arrived, and it was their job to get it up the stairs. Now, of course, I'd measured my flat. I made sure the sofa was going to fit perfectly. But the fatal flaw in my plan was I hadn't measured the stairs. My flat was on the third floor. They had to go up 3 different flights to get there. They didn't even get it up the first. They even took some of the plaster off the ceiling trying to get it up the stairs. And it got stuck. They eventually managed to remove it, and they had to take it back to the warehouse. And they told me to give their customer services phone number a ring. And that's exactly what I did. And I ended up on this phone call with a woman from customer services, and naturally she was going through a list of things to help resolve the issue. And the first question she asked me was, do you have a back door to your property that we can deliver it to instead? And I had to explain, no, I've just moved to this apartment. It's on the third floor. The only route up there is this flight of stairs. Okay. And I thought she understood that until she asked me the second question, which is, well, do you have a side entrance to your property? And I had to explain again that, well, no, it's an apartment. It's on the third floor. The only route up is this staircase. And then came the third question. And that was, do you have a friend's address or a family member's address that we can deliver the sofa to instead? And it was at that moment that I realized there was a huge misalignment between each of our objectives. Because, of course, I was buying a sofa to sit on in my new apartment, to socialize with friends, or to watch a movie, or to watch sports at weekends. But her objective was to successfully ship and deliver a sofa. It didn't actually matter what address it ended up to. And we see this kind of misalignment when we're selling enterprise software as well. So how can we better align to the objectives of our buyer? And how can we use financial metrics to do so? That's exactly what I'm going to discuss with you over the next 45 minutes. Now, it's not just sofas that I've bought over my lifetime, over my career. I've also been on the buying side of enterprise software, actually more than once. So I've been in the shoes of many of your stakeholders trying to find a budget to move forward in purchasing a solution to a problem. Now, I actually started my career as a qualified management accountant, as Sammy mentioned. And in management accounting, it's all about calculating return on investment of projects. Maybe that's internal projects, external projects, to help the business decide how to prioritize its limited resources and funds. Later in my career, when I worked at Deloitte, much of my work was helping large companies build these kind of internal business cases and calculate ROI to help move projects forward. Now, for the last 8 years, I've been working in pre-sales or solutions consulting, whatever you want to call it. And I've also led the global rollout of an ROI tool for our sales and pre-sales organizations, using my background in calculating ROI and using these financial metrics. So I'm going to share with you in this session this afternoon how I've used my experience in using financial metrics and building business cases to help align to the desired outcomes that buyers want to help progress deals. So we all know that when we're in an opportunity, as sales engineers, as solutions consultants, naturally, once we get to the end of a cycle, a deal is either closed won, great, or it's closed lost if they go with one of our competitors. But according to Gartner, 38% of business-to-business deals end up doing nothing. And there's lots of reasons why deals end up doing nothing. It might be that a project gets cancelled. It might be that actually perhaps it was never an opportunity. It wasn't properly qualified. Or perhaps there was just simply a lack of budget and we didn't get the senior level buy-in that we needed. And the list goes on. And if you take a look in your CRM, you'll see all kinds of reason codes as to why an opportunity will exit the sales cycle and end up doing nothing. And 38% is quite a big number, but it's not that businesses are buying less software. Actually, last year, according to Gartner, again, they found that 70% of companies were due to spend more on software in 2023 than the previous year. So that's significant growth. So the question is, what's happening to all of these opportunities that end up doing nothing? Well, to answer that question, let's take a look at a typical sales process. And I know that a lot of people on this webinar are coming from either a sales or a pre-sales background. This is something that'll be really familiar to you, even if in your company you might use different terminology. First of all, you're prospecting for contacts for the right leads. And ultimately, you want to qualify that as an opportunity. Okay. Then that's usually where your solutions consultant or your pre-sales person gets involved, does some needs analysis or discovery, does a demo, and then you'll put together some pricing, a proposal, there'll be a bit of negotiation, and then hopefully you win that deal. Or unfortunately, if they go with one of your competitors, then it's closed lost. But when I was on the buying side of some enterprise software, it looked very, very different to this. This is what it looked like. And when I've spoken to other people, I've read external analysis, this is pretty typical. Okay. First of all, I acknowledged that there was a problem in our organization that we needed to solve. Okay, that was the first step. But at that point, I couldn't quantify what that challenge was. And I didn't know how widespread it was. Is this something just in my team that's isolated, or is it company-wide? So naturally, I had to go to my VP and ask for the resources to actually go and do some analysis, do some internal discovery to understand how widespread is this challenge and how can we quantify it. Then I needed to find different options to how we could solve this challenge. And naturally, you've got to consider the costs and the resources required for each of those options. And it's at that point I had to take it to finance. Now, finance often have a budget for initiatives and projects that you're going to do, perhaps purchasing different types of software. But naturally, they're going to prioritize the projects and the bits of software that are going to have the best returns, the best outcomes for the business. Luckily, I was able to get them to prioritize my project. And it was at that point that I started establishing a buying process. I had to get procurement involved. I had to start talking with software vendors. And then eventually, we selected the vendor which was going to best fit our needs to solve the challenge. And that looks very different from the buying process. We know from CEB, some of you might have seen this stat before, they say that 57% of the buying process is done before speaking to vendors. And from my personal experience, that's exactly what I saw firsthand, because it wasn't really until step 5 in this process when I really started talking to vendors in earnest. And I think this is where we have that challenge. So we heard earlier that 38% of opportunities end up doing nothing. Well, it's because we're trying to fit a sales process into buyers who are at a different point in their buying process. Because if you look at these two lined up, there's a big mismatch. And actually, when I was on the buying side, I was probably a nightmare stakeholder for lots of different software vendors. And I suddenly understood why, as a seller, you have so many opportunities that you think are going somewhere, and then they end up not going somewhere. Okay. I think, first of all, when I was in my discovery phase, so stage 1, stage 2, I guess, I was doing some research to see if, is the problem that we're having, is this a common problem that other companies have? So naturally, you go to Google, you Google the kind of things that you're having challenges with. And the first thing that I saw were different websites from software vendors that help solve this kind of challenge. And of course, you get all kinds of really good blog posts and articles which help explain, here's the challenge and here's how we can help solve it. And on lots of those websites, there's a button that says, watch a demo. So naturally, I'm a solutions consultant. Of course, I want to see a demo. So I clicked on that button, ended up having a call with a BDR. The next thing you know, you're speaking with a sales rep. And then there's a solutions consultant involved. And now you're watching a demo. Now, from their perspective, I'm probably logged as an opportunity in their CRM. From my perspective, I was nowhere near close to even getting budget or even thinking about buying any software. I was just trying to understand our own internal problem. So from the vendor's perspective, they probably had to mark my opportunity in their CRM as not a real opportunity. And I was one of that 38% that exited the sales cycle. Now, equally, a little bit later, when we were looking at different costs, I also engaged with a couple of software vendors to try and find out what the costs were of doing a project. How long do these projects take? You know, how does that help us prioritize which way to go? And I got a few quotes from different vendors. But of course, even then it was really early because I was just trying to get an understanding of what did we need to budget for the next financial year to then start a new project. So again, with them, I was probably in their CRM and it went to no decision because we didn't do a project that year. But we were never going to do a project that year. And then finally, once we got through to step 5, establishing a buying process, that's when I had to bring procurement into the mix. And we actually ran an RFP process. I'd been speaking sort of loosely to 3 vendors at that point. I'd seen a couple of demos. I had a good understanding. My person in procurement, he said that we needed to have 4 vendors in the RFP process. I'd only been speaking with 3. So I had to very quickly reach out to a 4th one, get an understanding of what it is they do very loosely. But I knew it was sort of in the realm of the kind of thing that we were looking for. And they got invited to our RFP process. And that's where I became nightmare prospect number 3, because in reality, did they have a strong chance of winning this? Well, no, because I'd already been speaking with the other 3 and I knew that they were a pretty good fit. So yes, they did respond to our RFP, and no, they didn't win it. And I think that's another great reason of why you should be very wary of if you ever get sent a blind RFP from a prospect. You're probably making up numbers because someone in procurement has told them to invite another vendor to it. So that's 3 different ways that I probably was an opportunity that went nowhere from the perspective of a seller. But if we go back to this diagram here, it's not that I did nothing. I'm going to be the first person to say, I was working really hard on this project to try and get it off the ground, get the right business case together so that we could get funding for the next financial year. So here's what I want to correct. It's not that 38% of B2B deals do nothing. They just do something else. Because in many of these situations, when you take something to finance, yes, they might have a budget for buying new software that's going to generate efficiencies in their business, but it might just be one single pot of money. If they don't go with this project, it's just that they're going with a different project. They're just going to do something else and spend those resources elsewhere in the organization. It's not that they're doing nothing. But I think this is a step where lots of deals get stuck. So how can we solve this? What I've done is I've taken what I learned from my buying process and I've put this into a bit of a diagram. And you can split this very easily up into 3 different stages, I would say, of a buying process. The first one is awareness. For me, it was acknowledging the problem and understanding, okay, how widespread is this problem in my organization? Is this a problem that other organizations have? And if it is, if they're solving the challenge, Can I do the same? So it's asking us the question, why should we be changing? Okay. Then the next step is the evaluation process. So it's trying to quantify what that challenge looks like. And at that point, I was looking at different ways of finding a solution to that challenge. So that meant quantifying what does it cost us? And then with each of those different actions or different solutions, what's the cost? And that'll be a financial cost, but also internal time and resources. So that's really asking us, how do we want to change? So we've talked about why change. Now we're talking, okay, how can we change? Then the final step is the decision-making process. Okay. So that is, why should I go with each of the individual vendors that I'm speaking to? And when I thought about this, it became very clear to me that I was having to engage with lots of different stakeholders internally to put together a project plan, to put together a business case to get this over the line. And I was talking with very different levels of seniority throughout this process. When I started, when I acknowledged this problem, I had to take this to my VP. And really, that was very, very high level. This is what we're seeing in our organization. And my question to them was, can you help me allocate some resources so we can quantify this problem? Okay, when the answer was yes, I then had to go and do my analysis, my discovery. Now, that meant talking to people much lower down in the organization, people who understood the process, individual contributors, first line managers. They're the people who see the challenges day in, day out. Okay, and that's where we can start to quantify things. Then when we were in the evaluation stage, that's when I was then putting together my business case, considering the costs of the different options, and I had to present that to my CFO. Okay, so for my stage 3 into stage 4, suddenly I'm working with very senior stakeholders again. Okay, so showing what's the return on investment of a project, what other financial metrics can I use to build a really robust business case. Then finally, once I got the go ahead from them, now we had a project. So now we had to establish this buying process. Now, because we were doing an RFP, that's the way that procurement wanted to go. Again, I had to go back down the chain to more junior people who were, again, very, very close to the process to help build up requirements. And it's with those requirements that we built the RFP. So again, that was talking to individual contributors, first line managers, and then ultimately, once we've got that decision, it has to be approved by the CFO and other very senior stakeholders for which vendor we're going to go forward with. Okay, so I worked with lots of different people at lots of different levels to get that project off the ground. So when I think about, okay, how can we use financial metrics and other tools to help our prospects through this process? We need to have different levels of granularity of our metrics, depending on who we're speaking with at each stage in their buying process. Okay, if I'm talking to a CFO or a CEO or a CRO, depending on who you're selling to, they're not going to know all the nitty-gritty details of how a process works. They only see the big headline metrics and how it aligns to their strategic objectives. Whereas if I'm talking to someone much lower down in the organization, they're going to be closer to the process. They're going to understand the nitty-gritty bits of it. Okay. So on the far left then, when I was talking to my VP, we can use things like high-level case studies and showing how it aligns to strategic objectives. Then as we're going down into their analysis and the discovery, we can look towards things like maturity assessments, process analysis. This is really getting into the weeds. And this is where we need to be using lower down people in our stakeholder hierarchy. Once we've understood and quantified what that process looks like, and it's going to be different for anyone who's selling different products or services. If your big value proposition is saving time, in that process analysis, you can quantify how much time does it take to do this process or that process. Okay. Then if we can assign a monetary value to that time that it's being taken and the potential time that we could save, that's where we can calculate the cost of doing nothing. Okay. And I'm going to get to this. I'm going to take you through how we do that kind of calculation, because that's how we can drive urgency, and we can use that cost of doing nothing to help support calculating a return on investment. And that's what you need in a really robust business case, which again is going to get presented to someone very senior to allocate budget, probably in next financial year, to move forward with this project. And all of these metrics that we can use as tools to help guide a buyer through this buying process, they're all interconnected, but we need to look at them with different levels of granularity, depending on the type of stakeholder that we're speaking with. So let's start at the first left, the far left. When we're acknowledging the problem, you're likely talking to quite senior people, okay? The first thing that you can do is look at benchmarking, right? If you've got industry analysts who look at your part of the market, you might have, I don't know, Gartner or the Hackett Group, or maybe the big four, you know, EY, Deloitte, KPMG, who will do sort of industry analysis type reports that shows you what does good look like. What you can do is you can take that and you can compare that with headline figures from your prospect. That helps them understand and acknowledge the kind of challenge that they have when they compare themselves with top performers or best in class organizations in their industry or in their market. Now, if you don't have the luxury of selling into one of those markets where you've got lots of industry analysts, maybe it's a less mature market, you can do this kind of thing yourself by running a survey. And this is something I've done at a couple of organizations where you can poll your existing customers or even lots of your prospects. You can get it out on a newsletter, even on LinkedIn, to try to build up some metrics of what does good look like in the areas that your product or service can have an impact on. Okay. So it might be something that you send out through marketing. It might even be polls on a webinar like this. Okay, and then finally, you can think about maturity assessments. So when I was at Deloitte, my background's in consulting, we used to use these a lot. And it's where if you're talking to someone quite senior, they might not have all the granular details to quantify something. So you can at least talk quite qualitatively. So within a process, you can say, how mature is this process for you? Okay. Are you immature? You know, it's a manual, undefined process. Are you somewhere in the middle? Like, is it an emerging maturity where it's defined, but it's still very manual? Or is it something that's fully automated? Okay. And you can start to plot them on a linear scale across different processes. And that can help them understand, okay, where do they actually fit and what does good look like? Because they want to get to the far right on that maturity scale on all of these different processes. So thinking back to my sofa challenge, the friends issue, imagine I'm a company that sells coffee machines. Okay. I can combine a case study with an output of a maturity assessment or a survey. So I can compare that prospect. I can say, here's what a top performer looks like, and here's what your current state looks like, and here's this gap. Okay, so that's getting them to acknowledge the problem. But if you combine that with a case study, something like Central Perk coffee shop in Friends used our solution to automate 30% of the coffee serving process. Okay, that's showing them a solution to help close that gap, to help them become best in class. And what we often see with prospects is they've got a perceived small gap, especially if you're talking to people who have been in their organization for a very long time. They're doing things in a way that they always have done. So naturally, you think, yep, this is just the way we do things. If you can show them that actually there's a very big gap between what they're doing today and what best in class or what top performer looks like, then that starts to generate more urgency. So that's kind of your discussion with senior stakeholders. Now, when you get through to the next stage, when they're looking in that analysis and discovery and trying to quantify what that problem is, here's how you can help them. The first one would be for business process interviews. Now, when I was at Deloitte, we did a lot of this, mapping out what a process looks like, interviewing people who are actually involved in that process. Okay. And you can start to quantify how long does it take you to do step A? How long does it take you to do step B? And then also, how long does it take you to move from A to B? Because often you might have these individual steps in a process, but there might be the gaps in between the different steps that is actually the bit that takes a lot of time. Okay, so you can start to quantify things like that. Or equally, if you're dealing with slightly more senior stakeholders, you can take more of a top-down approach. So you can take to them, what does a best-in-class process look like? You can use that as a conversation starter to see, okay, where does their process deviate from what best-in-class looks like? Okay, so that can become a framework for a conversation to analyze where's the deviation, where's the gap. And then finally, quantification and analysis. So once you've understood this process, how do you quantify it? But also, how do you put a monetary value against it? Okay, so if we can base an assumption and say we can make this kind of saving on this process, how do we add a value to that? And I'm going to take you into an example. So to start with, we talked around comparison at a top level, comparing to top performers. And you can back this up with a case study. So we said Central Perk automates 30% of the process with our product. Then when we're in this discovery phase, you can start to look at all the little sub-processes that make up the broader process, because this is where you've gone downstream. So in this case, this coffee shop, it spends 100 hours grinding beans, 500 hours washing cups, 400 hours pouring coffee. Now, based on our case study, where for other customers, we've saved them 30% of time, we can use this as an assumption. We can say, if you can achieve the same as some of your peers and make this 30% saving, then here's what your target processes can look like. Okay, so it's currently taking them 1,000 hours with a 30% assumed saving. You should be targeting only spending 700 hours on this process. And this is where I see a lot of software vendors really fall down, because we can put together things like ROI calculators, and there's always going to be assumptions in them. But if we can't back up that assumption, especially if you're presenting this to finance, it doesn't have any credibility. So you've got to back up any of your assumptions or your calculations with things like case studies, evidence to show that this is a reasonable assumption. Now, when I started my career as a management accountant, this is the first thing you learn in accounting. Your financial model is only as good as your assumptions. If your assumptions don't make any sense, or you can't back them up, then the whole model fails. And I think if you take one thing away from this webinar, that's the most important thing, because you can all have ROI calculators on your website and things like that, but if they're not backed up with real evidence or case studies, they don't have the same level of credibility. All right. So now the next step is, how do we put a monetary value onto what that process is today? So we've looked at our as-is process. We've looked at our target process, and that's a saving of 300 hours. And that's what we're calling the cost of doing nothing. Because if you implement a solution to this problem, you can save 300 hours. So if you choose not to do something, what we're saying is you're actively choosing not to save 300 hours. Now you can put a monetary value on that. So if I've got someone working, it costs me £20 per hour for that employee to work in my coffee shop. If we can save 300 hours, that's going to be a £6,000 or dollar saving in my coffee shop. Okay, so that is the true cost of doing nothing. And when we're talking about instilling urgency into these opportunities, that helps us overcome the bias of always just doing the same thing how we've always done it. If you can put a dollar value or a pound value on doing nothing, now it feels like more of a conscious decision. This is going to cost us £6,000 a month or a year, whatever time frame, by not doing something. So we've looked at the top of the cycle, how we can look at case studies, help align them to strategic objectives. We've looked into the process where you're going down a level, so to down the chain in your employees, but also looking at the more granular metrics in that process. Then you can pull them back together and calculate what's the cost of doing nothing in monetary terms. The final stage of this is how can we put these into a business case? Because this is likely what's going to have to go to finance or senior leadership to get a project off the ground. And this is truly where our financial metrics come into this. So we're on stage 4. We're looking at prioritizing projects. The first thing we've got to do is first bring it back to the very beginning. How does this align to strategic objectives of your prospect or of your customer? Okay. If it's something like, if your value proposition is around cost saving, it might not matter so much if you can prove that there's going to be a very, very clear return on investment on doing a project with your solution. But this becomes even more important if your solution is around mitigating risk. Okay, you're not going to have such a clear return on investment. So it's even more important that you align your project to the corporate objectives for that organization, because that's what's going to help you get this through the door. Okay. Then the two big financial metrics that you can help your prospects calculate are break-even point and return on investment. So a break-even point is after how long does my project start giving me a net benefit? Okay, so at what point do my benefits outweigh the cost? For some projects, for some very high value projects, that might be within 12 months. For others, it might be 2 to 3 years. Okay. When we're looking at things like calculating return on investment, it's kind of like looking at the same thing, but in a different way. This is where we can say, over a set period of time, what is the return based on the cost, my original cost outlay. And that's a way that finance people compare different projects. So if I've got a set budget for software type initiatives for this year, they're going to look at the ROI on each project and also look at the certainty of the ROI on each of those projects as well. And if your ROI for your project is much lower than other projects, you know what they're going to prioritize. And again, it's another risk of them doing nothing from your perspective. Actually, it's them doing something else. So let me take you into how we can calculate some of these. We've already looked at the monthly cost of doing nothing. For our coffee shop, it was £6,000 or $6,000. Okay. And that's what we've got in pink. These are our monthly benefits if we go ahead with the project. In blue, we've got our costs. So when you're setting up a project, there's likely going to be some kind of initial outlay. Okay. If you need to implement a bit of software, your prospect's going to have to pay for that. Now you're a customer. And even if you do offer implementation for free, that I know a lot of software companies are starting to do now in the SaaS world, they've still got a cost. It's internal cost. They might need to take someone away from their day job to set it up and make sure it gets set up correctly. So that's still a cost from their perspective. And then if you're in a SaaS model, there's going to be that recurring revenue. So for your prospect, it's that recurring cost month over month. Now, what you'll see here is our benefits only start in month 5. So this is assuming that it takes us 4 months to get up and running. They're still going to have the initial implementation cost, and they're going to have that monthly license cost likely for each month. But then in month 5, they start seeing that monthly benefit. Now, if you look at the lines now, this shows our cumulative costs. So in blue, that's our cumulative cost. In pink, that's our cumulative benefit. The point at which they cross over, that's our break-even point. So in this case, we've got a break-even point of just 9 months, which is great. Now, that can be really important because if you don't already have budget allocated to your project, sometimes it might be okay if you can prove that there's going to be a payback period of less than 12 months within a single financial year. Sometimes that's acceptable for some finance teams, okay? So that's going to be very, very important if your value proposition is things like efficiency savings. If they can put some of their employees on something else, they no longer are having that same expenditure on this process. That's going to be something that's really important to get your project over the line. Now, calculating return on investment, it's a little bit different, but it's looking at a very similar thing. This is where we're comparing the net costs with the overall cost. So you'll take your benefit over a period of time. Let's say it's over a year. You take your benefit, you minus the costs, and then you divide it by the total cost. And it's expressed in terms of a percentage. So you can see in our example, over 1 year, the ROI is 14%, but over 2 years, the ROI is 186%. Where it gets to 100%, that's the same as your break-even point. So in this example here, you can see the break-even point is going to be somewhere between year 1 and year 2. So it might be about 18 months that we hit that 100%. Okay. And this is where we're taking into consideration, again, the initial setup costs, the recurring cost, and the monthly benefit. And so this is how we can really help our buyers move through the buying process. And I think this is something that's really important because, going back several years, I've been in solutions consulting for close to 9 years now. And I remember when I first started, there was so much of a focus on BANT, which is a way of qualifying an opportunity. Does your prospect have budget, authority, need, and a timeline? And if they do, then it becomes a qualified opportunity. Okay. And here's the challenge. If I look at this buying process that I went through when I was buying enterprise software, at what point was I BANT qualified? I'm going to say it was halfway through step 5. Okay. It's when I would have been working on this for about 6 months at that point. Only at that point did I have budgetary approval from finance. I had the authority to make a decision. And I had a timeline of when we were going to buy because I only have a timeline once I've established that buying process. Now, if you're in a company that still looks at BANT to qualify opportunities, my personal opinion is you've got to reassess because you've got to ask yourself if you'll only speak with a prospect who is BANT qualified, what other vendor has been taking them through this process, aligning to strategic objectives, analyzing their current process, quantifying what that could potentially look like, calculating the cost of doing nothing to help drive urgency, and ultimately feeding that into a business case. What other vendors have been doing that? So I think this is so important. And this is how you can use these kind of financial metrics in your sales cycles to help drive these opportunities forward. Because it's not just the sales cycle, how we look at it in a lot of CRMs and in a lot of sales organizations selling software. Often we do get this kind of misalignment with how your prospects actually buy things. So I guess I'm going to leave you with this. And that is what happens next. And I think this is really important too. It's showing the cyclical nature of all the metrics that we've talked about in this presentation. You start off with those case study metrics. Central Perk Coffee House automates their process by 30%. Now, likely that's the kind of case study that's coming out of marketing, okay? But we want to use it in our sales process to help coach our senior buyers into this is what other organizations in the same industry, in the same market are doing. Okay, that helps them acknowledge the problem. Then, as we went through that process, we started to tailor metrics for the client. So we analyze their process. We say, how do they compare with their as is compared to what does top performer look like, or what does best in class look like, and show them how to bridge that gap. But here's the most important thing, and I've seen this time and time again where software companies forget about this most important final step of this cycle. It's the handover over to customer success, if you've got a customer success team, to see, did your customer actually achieve the outcomes that they wanted? I started off this presentation looking at the misalignment between buyers and sellers. And we can't forget the fact that our objective as buyers is to sell a client software. But we can't just wash our hands, pat ourselves on the back and say, what a good job we've done once we sell that software. Because at that point, we haven't actually met the objectives of our customers. Their objectives is to solve a problem. And they're not going to meet that objective probably until they've fully implemented the solution. They've got all the change management they want around it. They've done the training for the users if you have users on your software, and they've really realized the value. So it's about going back to that customer, understanding, did they achieve their outcomes? If not, how can we support it? But if they did achieve those outcomes, it's feeding these back into case studies. And that's what completes the cycle, where we can use these metrics, feed them back into marketing, and start to create more case studies that we can use in more buying processes. So if we come back to this final idea then, how do you avoid getting your sofa stuck in a stairwell? Well, I've got 4 things. The most important thing is aligning it to strategic objectives. When you're talking to your most senior stakeholders in an opportunity, they're going to have goals. They might use an OKR structure, for example. And within each of those goals, they've likely got different metrics. Which of those metrics can you move the needle on? And if you can show them how it's going to help them achieve their goals, that's a huge win, and that's going to open doors for you. Next, it's then using the right metrics and the right case studies to build credibility. If you can show that you've achieved this outcome for this other similar organization, that's going to go a really long way. And you can use that to base your assumptions on when you're doing calculations of how you can help this organization. Okay. And ultimately, that's the 3rd step. That's how you calculate the cost of doing nothing, which is the title of this whole webinar. Okay. How can you help drive urgency by putting a monetary value on them actually taking action to make a difference in an existing process? But then finally, the big thing that I think does get missed, it's building a process to hand over successfully to customer success. And that's the final piece of the puzzle to align the objectives between buyers and sellers. We've got to make sure that our buyers achieve their objectives, complete that cycle, and then bring this back into a case study to start the whole process again. So look, I hope you found this really useful. I've really enjoyed presenting with Consensus today. I know a few of you, I think, have been putting some questions into the chat. If you've got any further questions, please do put them into the chat. We've got about 10 minutes left. And Sammy, if you're on, I'll pass over to you. Take us through some of those questions and I'll do my best to answer them.
Awesome. I'm here. So I'm going to try and find all the ones in the chat, guys. If you have any other questions, if you could put them in Q&A, that's the easiest place for me to find them. But it looks like we have a couple in the chat. So let's start there. How would you approach cost of doing nothing for a client that isn't doing a process to begin with? Example, we don't even have performance reviews here.
It's a really good question. So I guess the question for you then is, what's the benefit of them starting to do a process? Okay. What are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? Is it a time saving? And if so, you can simply look at the time and calculate it, multiply it by the cost of an employee. But if not, that's when we start to get into the realms of less tangible benefits, but there are certainly still ways that you can do it. So maybe if it's mitigating a risk, can you start to think about, okay, if that risk happens, what's the impact? And can you quantify that impact? And then by implementing this new process, does it mitigate that risk? And then how can you quantify that benefit? So that might be a way that you can look at it.
Awesome. So this one came through and I know it's the Friends reference, but I think it's a good question to answer. It's wouldn't the automated coffee machine put Phoebe out of a job? So I think what they're really asking is automating a part of this process going to put SCs out of a job? And I think it's a good question and we could kind of talk about that.
It's such a good question. And it's an interesting one because when we're looking at return on investment, one outcome that some prospects are looking at might be, reducing headcount, but actually more often than not, I don't see that. Often it'll be reallocating a resource to elsewhere in the organization where they can add more value. So, for example, I work for a company that sells accounting software. If they can automate some of their accounting process, actually, these highly qualified accountants can suddenly start to do much more value adding work. You can still put a value on the benefit because they're no longer spending their time on this process, but we can reallocate them to something else over here where they can actually add more value to the organization. I'll give you an example. We're on a consensus webinar. I've implemented consensus before. And with that business case that we did, it's not about, reducing the amount of work that our solutions consultants are doing. It's about having them refocus their energies on the stuff that really matters. And actually, all the stuff that I've put in this webinar, that's exactly the goal of trying to automate your intro demos with a video automation platform, because your SCs can do more consultative work where they can really use their skills, use their expertise to help guide buyers through a buying process rather than doing the same demo over and over again, day in, day out, perhaps where you've not had enough discovery, and actually put their skills and their competencies to work and to add more value to the organization.
Yeah, I love that. And there's a lot of data on that actually in our SE and workload and compensation report that Consensus puts out yearly. We haven't put the 2023 one out yet, but the 2022 one is still available on our website. And there's a ton of data that just really helps, to your points, Tom, explain why demo automation can really help better an SE organization be more aligned on what actually matters and kind of automating those smaller things. Okay, well, I haven't seen any other questions come through the chat. But if you guys do have, oh, yeah, we're asking for a copy of the slides. So that is a Tom question. We will send a recording of the session. Tom, if you're okay with sharing the slides, we'll share them. Otherwise, if you want people to connect with you directly to share them, that's fine as well.
100%. So I've actually put a QR code on this final slide. That'll take you through to my LinkedIn. Feel free, anyone who's been on here, drop me a message. Very happy to share the slides for sure.
Awesome. We did have one other question come through, so we can just answer this one really quick. Would you ever share the cost analysis of consolidating their tech stack with clients? Meaning if they go with your product and are eliminating 3 to 4 other products, showing the licensing amount, et cetera, they are saving, would you show the hard numbers?
I would say 100% yes, but you've got to do it in the right way. I think with a lot of these things, this isn't something that as a solutions consultant or a sales engineer, it's not something that you do in isolation. You've got to work with the client. You've got to work with your prospect. So I wouldn't want to just guess what they're spending on a competitor's piece of software. Work with them. If that's the kind of thing that they're happy to give you, absolutely help build it in. If it's not something that they can give you, okay, well, can you help? Can you give them a blank space for them to fill it in? So the idea is just facilitating them to build a robust business case. It's not something that we're just delivering to them. I'll give you a really good tip. When I was working as a consultant, one of the big things we used to do was actually never use our own slide decks. When we're working with a client, we would always use a template of their slide decks. Okay. So when we did some analysis, we would co-create it with them. And then when we give it to the person who'd assigned us on a project, it's in their corporate branding, their corporate messaging. The idea is for them to go and take it internally. They can present it as their own, even though they've had a consultancy working on it, because it makes them look great. But it also means they've got to be happy to stand behind that. I think the risk is if you're just presenting something to them with numbers that you've come up with, it creates that kind of us and them. Whereas the idea of this is we're supposed to be coaching them and mentoring them through that buying process. We've got to be consultative because that's going to increase the likelihood that they can then stand behind those numbers. They've got to understand the assumptions, going back to that one. They've got to be able to understand the full calculations so they can stand behind it and present it to their leaders to get that budgetary approval if that's what you're pushing for.
Love it. Awesome. Well, we got a lot of accolades happening in the chat, but I think we might all be done with questions. So, like Tom mentioned, guys, definitely connect with him on LinkedIn here. If you want a copy of those slides, he can get that to you directly. We will share a recording of the session in the next couple days. Thank you so much, Tom, for lending us your time and expertise. Thank you to everyone who joined us for the session, and we'll see you guys hopefully all at DemoFest in a couple months.